All right, everybody, welcome. It's really great to see you. I'm glad you tuned in. I'm Mike Price, and I am hosting this YouTube channel. And as some of you may or may not know, I'm doing an investigation into a band called Creddypool that existed in the 90s in the Seattle music scene that are virtually unheard of for the most part. But you know, if you dig deep enough under the surface, you can find musicians who had contact with this band at some point in their career, or played with them or heard of them, and we're unearthing that. And my first guest today on the YouTube channel for my first episode is none other than Todd Dammit Kerns. All right, Todd.
I love the none other. there could be another Todd Dammit Kerns. We don't know that.
We don't know. We don't have confirmation. You know, there could be a parallel universe out there, right?
Real estate in Simi Valley somewhere. Todd Dammit Kerns. It's not me though.
You know, another powerful and attractive lad.
Well, let him deal with that. I'll deal with this. What I got going on.
So, how are you, Todd? It's really good to see you.
It's so good to see you. I miss Vancouver so much. I've been, in the States. The States are opening up, but I haven't been up there in 14 months, 16 months since I've been to Vancouver.
Really?
So, yeah,
wow.
it's been nuts. So I've been, separated from my Canadian family the whole time. So, but yeah, it's been such a crazy time, and it's been very productive and very creative at the same time, even though it's been, obviously, what it is,
So do you consider yourself, obviously you consider yourself a Canadian, but, you spent quite a bit of time in Vancouver. Do you consider yourself like, Vancouver's your home? Do you have a connection there?
I do. My children were born in Vancouver. My parents retired to Vancouver. They're in Kelowna now. But my roots in Vancouver are probably in many ways, it's very difficult because our band was such a cross-country type thing. We have like roots in Edmonton and Calgary and Winnipeg, even though we're from Saskatchewan, the roots are obviously very, very much there. But even Toronto, we had a lot of we put a lot of ground down in Toronto once the Much Music and the video type era started to happen in the 90s. So, but Vancouver's very much home. They were graceful. They're great. I'm super grateful that they put a star of my name right out in front of the Roxy next to
I know
other worthy people. I'm like, who did we pay off for that one? But it's, you got Bryan Adams and Sarah McLachlan, and then this Todd Kerns guy, and not the real estate guy from Simi Valley.
That's right. Everybody must mix you up with that guy. Yeah. I've seen that guy's face on the sides of buses,
exactly. Or bus stops. It's like,
and in Vancouver, that's the crazy part.
There's a Simi Valley real estate's really hot in Vancouver. I don't know why.
It's hot everywhere now because of Todd Kerns. Let me tell you.
That Todd Kerns.
Yeah. So, why don't you give us a little bit of background here for the folks that might not be up to speed on your full history? Maybe a little condensed snippet of who is Todd Kerns?
Born and raised in Saskatchewan, spent a chunk of time in northern Manitoba, freezing cold. I lived in the freezing cold and kept moving further and further away from it as soon as I was able to do so. The band Age of Electric was formed in Saskatchewan in '89, which is a fascinating thing to wrap our heads around these days. We made our way west of Vancouver with Bob Rock, the producer, Metallica, Motley Crue. He kind of beckoned us west, said, movie stars, swimming pools,
Vancouver is the place you ought to be.
Exactly.
So you loaded up the van and you moved to 604.
Moved to Surrey to rhyme it. But
in
fact, you were one of the first people I met out there in a funny way at like Club Soda and places like that, playing clubs and just trying to get some sort of, some following out there. And it happened pretty quick for us. There was an interesting shift of styles from the 80s into the 90s that happened. But with Bob, it was a perfect time. And then from there, we signed a deal out of New York with Mercury Records, and that happened. And then it didn't happen. And then, Universal Records in Canada, and we did the thing. And, there's some gold records and things like that involved. And we had a really good run, for me. And then when that kind of went away, my brother and I had a band called Static and Stereo. My brother John had also been in Age of Electric with me. and we sort of split off, and we brought our youngest brother Ryan into this band, Static and Stereo, and we did only one album before. It was a wacky time. The music industry was a wacky thing with the downloading and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, one brother moved to Toronto, and it was just kind of like, I sort of found myself recording bands and making a solo record. And then out of nowhere, the United States called. And I never really had any intention of relocating. Like people keep saying, I never intended to live in the United States. That was just sort of like a lot of stuff was going on down here. And I always kind of felt like it would be really interesting to kind of suss out some extra stuff I could be doing. And then I was bouncing back and forth, Vancouver, LA, Vegas, kind of that sort of triangle. And then it just got so busy. Once the Slash thing happened, I really sort of found myself, very much sort of anchored here.
Now, how did that happen? How did that whole connection happen? Because, I mean, it seems like a fairly big jump, in terms of, career-wise, where, you were playing in these bands, trying to get your career off the ground. And then all of a sudden, fast forward to like, the most famous, best known, and one of the greatest guitar players from one of the biggest bands in the world. And, you're playing on stage with them. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it was surreal. It was the weirdest thing is that we had crossed paths in 1992, I want to say. Age of Electric had made a trip down to play some showcase things at the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Roxy right on the Sunset Strip. And we would hang out at the Rainbow every night. We didn't have any money. I don't know why they let us in there, but but we were there. And Slash was there very regularly, Lemmy, all these guys, you'd see them all the time. And then Slash just came over to our table one night and was like, "Hey, who are you guys?" And we were like, this is just before Use Your Illusions had come out. So maybe it was 91. I guess it was probably 91. And, they were the biggest band in the world, and Slash sat down with us, had some drinks, hung out with us. He has no recollection of that, by the way. I've talked to him about that on a couple of occasions. Fast forward 1,000 years later, and I'm like, our drummer, who's also Canadian, Brent Fitz, had been in like Theory of a Dead Man, Econoline Crush, a lot of things like that. Then he relocated to Los Angeles, and he found himself. He just texted me one day. He said, "The new drummer from Slash is from Winnipeg," was all it said. And I laughed. I go, "Oh, okay. So he got the gig with Slash." I go, "That's awesome. I never intended to try and wedge myself in any way, shape, or form." I was like, "That's great." And then like a little while later, he called me, and we're having some trouble with this position. "Do you want to come down?" And I'm, "Yeah, sure, I'll come down." And what I thought was just going to be a quick casual jam turned into, next week we're doing Leno and Craig Ferguson's show, which is now James Corden's show. And I was like, whoa, what? And that was really, I wasn't sure if it was going to be like, one of those like 3 months of fly out weekends, which just really got sucked into this black void of a year and a half on the road. The house I'm sitting in, I had purchased and closed on 7 days before I was gone for a year and a half, pretty much. So, here's my new house and goodbye, so good problem to have. And that was 11 years ago, 2010. And we are getting ready to put out a new record now. So by the time it comes out, it'll be 12 years of me doing this with this pretty much the same cast of guys.
Wow, that's incredible. So how did you find the transition? Because I mean, previous to playing with Slash, obviously you were, predominantly frontman / guitar player in all of your projects. How was the transition to, becoming, a bass player and, part of the rhythm section and stepping back?
I started in that position, actually, and I talk about it a lot. I talk about it a lot these days because people often bring up that question, but I started on bass. I was always one of those guys. Duff McKagan and I have had this conversation a lot, how like Duff was a guitar player and a drummer and he played a lot of everything. But when he relocated to Los Angeles, he took a look around and saw this level of guitar playing that was going on and said, well, I'll be a bass player. You know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. And I was sort of one of those guys because I was never really interested in being Eddie Van Halen. I was sort of like, that's for those guys. But it sounds like a lot of time spent in your basement and in your bedroom playing guitar, and I was busy socializing and trying to be popular, I guess. I don't know. I liked playing music. I just didn't have that. I was a punk rock guy. So it was sort of like, getting into the Ramones and stuff like that seemed like the ceiling. I was like, I am happy right here. So
exactly.
Doesn't mean I can't get around on guitar and whatnot. I just kind of wasn't really interested in that whole avenue. And then it turned out, because I just wanted to be in a band, but it was sort of like, as it happens in any jam room or any basement, who is the least worst singer is usually how it works. Like who sings better than the other guys, and it sort of quickly goes like,
who sucks the least?
Exactly, yeah. And I was happy just to be like kind of like in the background going, isn't this fun playing in a band and girls are actually talking to us, and then it's sort of like, okay, Todd's the singer, and I'm like, oh, okay, and there's a great deal of responsibility. So I was suddenly Sting, with the bass and singing, and I would say Geddy, but I was not in that league. I was barely in, Sting's league, not even close. But I, sort of went into that world. And then it wasn't until my little brother, John, started playing bass that I moved over. So actually, it was Age of Electric that really was the step where my youngest brother, not youngest brother, but my brother, John, picked up the bass. It was infinitely better than he's still better than I am. And we just decided, well, let's put a band together. I'll play rhythm guitar and sing kind of thing. And then the other brothers from the Age of Electric came in, and that's how that kind of came down. So in a lot of ways, it sort of made sense. But when I came back around to the other side of things, when I came into the States, I sort of presented myself as sort of wearing a whole lot of hats and being sort of, I can do this, I can do that, I can do whatever you want in a lot of ways.
Utility man.
In a sense, yeah, because it was a lot about session work. It was a lot about fill-in work and whatnot. And it just sort of kept me busy. And I'm one of those guys that it's like, I really enjoy playing this role or that role. Like I be the bass player, I can be the singer, I can be the guitar player, I can be the guitar player singer, I can be the bass player singer, So I could play keyboards if you really want to put a gun to my head. I could probably play the drums, but I would only play in some sort of garage band if you wanted me to. But yeah, so I just really like music that much that it didn't really feel kind of held back by one thing or the other. And when the bass playing position presented itself within Slash, it was just kind of like, that's exactly the kind of bass playing I come from. Duff and I come from a very similar school, although Duff was teaching at that school and I was just a student.
Right.
Like that. He was the Mr. Miyagi.
That's wax on, wax off.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's obviously, this year, most of this year and a little bit of last year, I mean, it's been incredibly challenging, obviously, to our industry, right? We've been impacted in a way that it's almost undescribable to people because, for a lot of the world, life is relatively unchanged with the exception of, some, I was going to say minor inconveniences, but for some it's a major inconvenience, like some people work from home, if you're a restaurant worker and stuff like that, or involved in travel or tourism, you have been impacted to some degree, most definitely. But I don't know if people can really relate to what it's like to be in the music industry, because it was like one day, all of a sudden, you get the phone call. And it's not the phone call that you're laid off or you're fired or there's a shortage of work. It's the phone call is, this industry, until further notice, and we don't know when this is done.
Yeah.
Like, it's just done. We can't even talk about it. We don't have a plan. We can't tell anybody anything. And now you've got thousands or millions of people that are, directly involved in this industry, all like, taking a good hard look in the mirror and going, okay, so we weren't prepared for this. No one warned us. Now what do we do? And we're talking people with families and houses and plans.
Oh yeah.
Who still have yet to return to work. So how has COVID affected, your career and your life?
It's so interesting because in a lot of ways, I've had so many conversations with, as you know, I record conversations with a lot of musicians and friends of mine for my own thing, but it's been really interesting hearing like every different take on this kind of thing. Because for me, it was, even though it's such a terrible situation overall, the case of why we had to shut down and what it's done to so many people. And you worry about that little coffee shop that you like or that restaurant that you like, these places, everything's having trouble staying afloat. For me, it actually ended up being very, very positive in terms of I am not a time off guy. I don't know how to say no. And I always am in a, even currently as things are sort of quietly firing up, I've got like, 3 things on my plate all at once. And you're like, that's just kind of how I operate. I've always been sort of a multitasker that way. And So when it was initially sort of forced upon us, it was sort of like, yeah, I could do 2 weeks on the couch. I thought 2 weeks, a month. My wife had been through SARS in Toronto, so she was kind of like, I think it's going to be, we're talking like 3 months. She was thinking, and I go, oh, you're crazy. It's like this will be, it'll in it. If you would have told me that back then, I would have said, that we'd be still talking about this. I would have said you're nuts. But it ended up being very positive for me in terms of like sort of a reboot in terms of, and then all of a sudden my friends are like, we just put out a record with some friends of mine from Ace Frehley's band that was completely done remotely, people sending tracks back and forth and just having fun, and really with no intention of like touring. Well, clearly we can't tour on it anyway, but you just kind of like, I found myself writing more than ever because this guy wanted to do this and that guy wanted to do that. We were sending tracks back and forth. That said, I mean, as positive as one can make it, it's certainly, stunted everybody's style. And we're all kind of like, as you mentioned, whether you're in security, in driving trucks, driving bus, there's so many different positions within the world of an actual touring band that I could see the punk rock clubs bouncing back really fast. Like we're all going to go out and play, rock clubs or whatever. It's the bigger shows. It's, the Slash feature Miles Kennedy and the Conspirators band is essentially an arena act. In other parts of the world, we can do arenas no problem. That's not on the table. We might be able to do some stuff in the US coming up eventually. Then you get into that next level of Guns N' Roses, Kiss, Rolling Stones, and that kind of stuff. Those level of tours, trying to get that many people into a venue and what that means to make that work financially on all aspects is nearly impossible to think about. And the people who have been in real trouble, I mean, there's people who are in real trouble week one when this went down, or within the first few weeks were like, how am I going to make rent? How am I going to make any of this work? So I feel very fortunate that I've always had trouble saying no to things. So I've done a pretty good job of kind of keeping stuff kind of like afloat during all this. And now it's all behind the scenes. Like I'm about ready to head off to out of state to work on another record for a few weeks. Then I come back to California and work on another record. So there's a lot of that going on. There is quite a bit of creativity going on, so that by 2022, when things are happening, it's going to be a traffic jam of new music and bands going on the road, at least through the United States and hopefully Canada. So in the meantime, it's just been, what can you do? I've tried. I'm a very optimistic cat. Like I talked to a friend recently who was very sort of like, I don't think things are ever going to go back to normal. I think things are completely irrevocably changed. And I'm like, I don't really think that. I really kind of feel more like, I think things will be okay. I think things are going to be wacky, and we're all going to look back on this particular chapter and go like, that was nuts. But I really do believe that there's a lot of cool stuff coming.
Like a bad plane ride.
Yeah. It's
you're
weird.
like, you get off after, you're shook up. Oh fuck, I don't want to fly again.
Yeah. Then a month later, you're on a plane. Yeah.
Right. It could be like a really bad relationship that you never want to repeat again, right? You're like, okay, we were not doing that again.
Yeah. Even in the best case scenario, you survived it. You didn't thrive in it.
Best case scenario. But, I think things will return in 2022. Yeah. I think people just need to be patient. I know it's really tough. Mm-hmm. And I know it's hard on the musicians in the music industry, but in order for us to return to any significant level of work, it needs to be complete, right? It can't be, well, you can play in Florida and you can play in Texas. Okay, well, you can't book tours that way. It's also not cost effective. So until we can return to the traditional form of organized touring sequentially and geographically, we're just going to have to hold tight. But I think you're absolutely right. I could see, the smaller clubs, coming online soon. Mm-hmm. And I think that there will be some artists that are going to want to take advantage of that. And you remember those things we used to do, the Molson, I think it was Molson, the blind dates?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
We used to do those, I think, in the early 90s. And, they'd take a band like the Sex Pistols and, they'd put them into some small club. What did I do on those? I think I did like Stone Temple Pilots.
I remember that one too, yeah.
Jane's Addiction. We did Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, I think, at the Town Pump. And Chris Cornell, I can never remember if it was Molson or Labatt's, but anyway, Chris Cornell deliberately says on stage, "We'd like to thank Labatt's." And he knew that it was, we'll take your $1 million, but we're gonna, you know what I mean? We're still gonna be us, and we're gonna still say that you suck, even though we took your money.
Punk rock, I guess. Yeah,
and I mean, that was just pretty classic. So, as far as that whole punk rock thing goes, I mean, it's interesting that you sort of had a background in punk rock, because I obviously had a, background in punk rock. So before I moved out to Vancouver, I was playing in a punk band in Montreal, and, we were bashing our heads against the wall, and, like everybody else, trying to, make your mark and make some noise and gain some attention. We did a little bit of touring and whatnot, but I'm always fascinated when I learn after the fact that somebody else was involved in the punk rock scene back when I was, because it's not always blatantly obvious.
No.
And sometimes you don't know until you talk to somebody. And then as soon as they make that connection, it's like, you're my new best friend. Like, you were before and I liked you, but now it's like we have this common ground. And, in the punk rock scene, when you're a kid and growing up in that, you develop relationships, and, you become deeply entrenched, and it becomes sort of, that punk rock attitude sort of, creeps into your system and your personality, and it stays with you, right?
That's true.
Find that you still got a lot of that it influences you, musically today?
Well, yeah. I mean, the weird thing for me is growing up in small town Saskatchewan, as removed from really anything, where there's really no, like when I watch, shows that, like, say, The Breakfast Club, where there's like there's the high school head, and then there's the jock, and then there's the preppy girl. And I go, well, if that was our town, it'd be like literally The Breakfast Club. It'd be like those 5 people would be these separate groups. It was like, there wasn't big enough groups for this to be really a thing. So being involved, loving punk rock the way I do, I was never really involved in a scene like that all my friends were involved in, because it didn't exist. Like, we grew up, loving what we loved. And I think that's kind of the beautiful thing that I always attribute to what I feel fortunate enough being, is that whether it was, you're into like punk rock and classic rock and heavy metal and all these things that sort of came at you, and you just sort of sat there mixing together this goulash of like all the things you liked, and you just didn't really pay a lot of attention to the things you didn't like, because to me it was kind of like, it wasn't until you were in the city where it was like you had to have this kind of haircut to listen to this kind of band, and had to have this kind of haircut to listen to that kind of. We were kind of like, Joey Ramone's got long hair, I have long hair. It's kind of like, I don't understand, the New York Dolls have long hair, the MC5 had long hair. And, I realized that things became a lot more tribal that way, in terms of, the removal of putting sort of like scenes and an image to things, So to me, I kind of always felt fortunate. And we grew up playing high school dances, and then that became like, well, now you're playing, hey, punk rock guy, you're playing Heaven by Bryan Adams for the girls to dance to, and we were like, okay, we were just like young. I was just so thrilled to be playing music that it didn't really hit me until we became more like original, like writing our own music, that we became more like, this is what we want to do. It just sort of felt like this is what you need to do to play in these clubs. And back in those days, there was a huge cover scene across Canada that we would go back and forth and back and forth. And I was like 19 years old, just kind of like doing this whole thing. And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized that there was even like this other world that existed that I could have lived in. And Age of Electric sort of sprung out of this world of like working in nightclubs that were largely intended to be cover rooms, where we would do our music interspersed with songs that we liked, covers. And then we built an audience all the way across the country before we started even putting out, well, essentially cassettes and then that kind of thing. So the punk rock ethos was involved, with a weird mixture of like the cult and, like kind of like, this weird hair kind of thing. But we weren't really super into, wasn't necessarily all Sunset Strip stuff. It was actually a lot more Hanoi Rocks and Dogs d'Amour and that kind of stuff kind of going on. And then, as you know, by the time we got to Vancouver, there was such a transition a jarring transition that started to occur. You know, everybody talks about it like it was like, and then Nevermind, or Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, and the next day everything changed. I go, that's not really true. It was as subtle as, in reality, I always equate it back to when Appetite for Destruction came out, because there was a lot of like big hair and white pants and big shiny things, and then Guns came along, and it became way more street, way more. Well, I like to use the word authentic, though I'm very careful with it, because I think Guns, they just seemed like the real deal. They didn't seem like it was an act. They seemed mildly scary, like there was hair involved and there was all that street kind of LA stuff. It wasn't the glitzy, glammy Sunset Strip. It was the back alley behind the Sunset Strip. You know what I mean? And so that transitioned into that. And then when the grunge thing started to happen, it wasn't necessarily overnight, but it was very quick. As you were there, I mean, we could talk on that, because everybody talks about like, then we all had to go get the haircuts. It's like, no, I mean, Guns, Soundgarden were essentially a hard rock band, just a different flavor. Alice in Chains, those kind of groups were essentially, when I look back at them now, I go, wow, these guys are a lot more hard rock than we sort of perceived them to be. Like there's a lot more Sabbath going on and a lot more of that kind of stuff, where Nirvana is clearly a lot more punk rock, and with popisms in there too. I
mean, so the club that I used to work at, Club Soda in Vancouver, was sort of a really interesting sort of venue, because on the weekends, well, most of the time, what ended up happening with that club is it was a top 40 club. It was owned by Sam Feldman and Bruce Allen.
Right.
So they wanted to add another downtown room to the circuit, and they could book cover bands in. So it started with cover bands, and then I convinced the manager there to let me book Monday nights as an original night, and I called it Metal Mondays. Right. And I made a deal with the guy, Steve Harris, Band to the Bar. Do you remember him?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
He had this drink he used to make all the band members drink. It was called a Billy Badass. And I don't know what was in it. It was just like, it was pure death. And he would light it on fire, and then he would make you drink it through a plastic straw. And if you didn't drink it quick enough, you'd be sucking in melted plastic and fumes. Like it was brutal. So everybody feared this guy. So I made a deal with him that if he gave me one Monday to book, if it wasn't successful, I dropped the idea. Okay. But if it was successful, I wanted to keep it going. So of course, the first one was hugely successful, and the rest, as they say, is history. And what was really cool, I remember what I liked about you guys is I had an immediate sense that, you were different than a lot of the other top 40 bands, because a lot of the other top 40 bands were perfectly content to just play top 40.
Right.
Get their weekly paycheck, hang out with strippers, have a cab. And
the way you're describing it seems like something we should be doing now, frankly.
But I mean, you figure you're set. I mean, you're 19 years old, you're on top of the world. It's great. Yeah. But you guys were actually into original music, which I really related to. And, so in that venue, we were booking, Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone and all these original bands.
Mookie Blaylock.
Yeah, exactly. And what was really cool is that, the top 40 bands would get into town on Monday, and they'd start playing on the Tuesday. So on Monday nights, the cover bands would come down and check out all this original stuff. So they were also being exposed to a lot of these bands at that time. And you could really see a transition. Yeah. You were starting to see, the haircut slowly creeping in. You were starting to see, the style of music altering. Now, all of a sudden, sort of what you guys started, because I think you guys were the first top 40 band that I knew that even had songs and had a record. But then all the other bands are starting to play less top 40, focus on original, then getting into the studio. Yeah. And kind of taking advantage of our proximity to Seattle.
Oh, 100%.
Because, the fact that we were close meant, there was opportunity for those bands to, to get out of Dodge and go play somewhere else and kind of see how it works on a different audience. And by the same token, it opened up opportunities for bands from this area to go down and play Seattle. Did you guys play Seattle much?
Not really. That's what I find so surprising, is that when we got out to Vancouver, we kind of suffered what a lot of Canadian groups suffer, is that we built such a following in Canada that it was sort of almost scary to imagine, well, we can go, 4 hours that way and play to a packed room. Why would we want to go south and play to nobody or start from scratch in a way? We did do a lot of like showcasing in New York and showcasing in Los Angeles because of the label situation. Seattle didn't happen as much for us, but I really regret that we didn't do more of that. But I will say, our trip into Vancouver and those first, initially it was very quick. Like we'd go to a place like Club Soda. We'd do a week of dates. We had always sort of had that mentality of like, we will do, this week in a top 40 room where we're getting paid. And that money always went back into the band. It went back into recording stuff and kind of going forward. I like to look back at it as like, this is the Beatles in Hamburg, having to go out and play,
Right.
Little Richard and Chuck Berry songs for 12 hours a night or whatever they were doing, hopped up on speed. But, it sort of made us, and I've never regretted it in a way. And I've talked to a lot of people about this because like when I talked to Slash, he never went through that in LA. That was not a thing. You just kind of like, you wrote songs and you did it. But I've been on stage since I was 14, 15 years old, to the point that now to walk on stage is like, basically totally second nature. I don't have that feeling of like, what do we do? What do we say to the audience? It's like the kind of thing of like, we had built all that, gotten all that out of our systems before we'd ever, sold a record, so that by the time we kind of stepped into that game, we kind of had done all this minor league stuff. So I felt okay about that. But by the time we got into Vancouver, it was sort of like you brought up. It was like we had seen so much of this stuff bubbling up, and it was bubbling into Vancouver. So, and that real transition into a new sound and a new thing, because you know how it is in Los Angeles, New York, Vancouver, Toronto. It's like things kind of, whatever's new kind of works its way from the coasts back into the middle of the country. So when you go into the middle of the country, you could still do whatever was cool 5-10 years ago, and it's still working. But you get to the coasts and it's like, whatever's happening right now, that's what's happening. So it really kind of was a kick in the pants when we got to Vancouver and saw, I think we brought our own thing to it too, which probably made it kind of unique, as being able to kind of have a completely different perspective than what was going on in Vancouver. But we saw that influence of the Seattle thing kind of, if you would have told me at the time, Seattle's going to be the next hotspot of music, I think any of us would have been like, Seattle, Washington? Are you sure? Like, it's probably going to be, Los Angeles. But I guess Detroit or, any of those cities had a scene too. So why shouldn't Seattle?
I remember very, very specifically, it was like I was watching a movie in slow motion when The Change came, because I remember when Appetite for Destruction came out. I remember when the Guns N' Roses, Welcome to the Jungle, started getting high rotation on MTV.
Yeah.
And then I also remember, when Alice in Chains' Man in the Box came out. And I found them to be incredibly similar.
Yeah.
Obviously Guns N' Roses was a little bit more towards the, the rock sort of metal glammy side of things. But when Alice in Chains came out, it was such a new sound.
Yeah.
And it really did seem like it was almost overnight. I don't know if you remember, but in Vancouver, for example, it just seemed to me like every single band was all of a sudden, dressing like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. I used to produce bands back in the day. I was cutting demos for up-teen bands, and a lot of those bands were, very, very influenced by that sound. And you actually watched their sound transition from this unique original sound they had, and it all started morphing into that grungy sound. And what's fascinating, I find, about a lot of those bands that I worked with back in those days, and I'm sure it's the same, everywhere. You'll come across bands that you think have great talent and great songs, and you believe in those bands, and you think that they have what it takes to become a successful band. And so often what unfortunately happens is these great bands don't, they fail to execute. They don't launch. They just, all kinds of reasons, like,
of course, yeah.
And usually if it's not, music industry politics or, internal band struggles and problems, it just seems like something holds these bands back. And then what ends up happening after the fact, much like what happened with my band, you become this mythical unicorn band, and everybody talks about this band like, oh, back in the day there was this band and they were really great. Well, people ask me that all the time. Like, it's one of the first questions people ask me when I do interviews, because we get together and we play shows every once in a while, and they're always like, why didn't you guys stay together? You guys were great. You could have been the best thing, which I totally think about, Age of Electric. I mean, in my opinion, Age of Electric should have been, the Tragically Hip, but you have your own story, right? So yeah. We all have these stories, and what this kind of reminds me about is, so I've been researching these Seattle bands, and primarily this band called Creddypool. And what drew me to Creddypool was, the more information I got about this band was that, well, that's me.
You're right, yeah.
Except they're called Creddypool and they're from Seattle and they're a different sounding band, but I think their story, is relatable to so many musicians and so many bands,
Oh, absolutely.
Like, who are these guys? Like, so anyway, after doing the research on this band and, tracking down, tapes and talking to people and, digging up information and trying to find photographs and stuff of these guys, I thought it was incredible to find out that, you have, sort of a connection with Creddypool as well, I believe, at some point. What I heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that that Punchy, the guitar player from Creddypool, he was pretty tight with Duff. I mean, obviously being a Seattle band.
Right, yeah.
And I know that Duff was heavily involved in, punk rock and, more of the grungier type sound before, hooking up with Guns N' Roses. So I heard that Punchy, the guitar player from Creddypool, and Duff, loaded up the truck and, moved to Beverly.
They literally moved to Beverly, yeah.
Yeah, and the next thing you know, they're down, and hanging out at the Roxy and the Rainbow and the Whiskey. And I think Punchy was he was enrolled in he went to school down there.
MIT or
I think
whatever,
he went to
or
MIT
GIT or one of those things.
Yeah. So he went down to do that, but I don't know. I heard that it didn't work out for him. Like, I'm not sure why, really. He didn't fit into the LA scene. It just...
Right.
And I heard that once things started taking off, that he packed his bags and he got an offer to go back and, jump into this project that was, part of that grunge scene, which his buddies in Seattle said, this is the place you got to be.
Right.
So he goes back up the coast. But did you ever meet him or have contact with him or play with the band or hear about the band, like when you guys were down in LA and stuff?
No, it's like talking about Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster when you bring it up in terms of like, when you meet somebody, because I have the same conversations about people who saw Jeff Buckley before he died or any of those kind of things that were kind of, oh, you were there, kind of thing. A lot of those Creddypool things existed in cassette tapes with no song titles on the thing. Like, here, listen to this. You don't even know what, and you're like, what the hell is this? This is amazing. And then eventually, of course, it's on CDs, CDRs with no, eventually you kind of like pass these things around. Like, it reminded me of back in the day when that mixtape thing would bounce around, like, especially in the punk rock world, it was a lot more like, you would sort of like, this cool band from Winnipeg, that cool band from DC, that cool band from, and you'd pass things around. But Creddypool seemed to be one of those things that would kind of float around. And even the things that they were in prior to that, especially Punchy's earlier punk rock stuff, like bands like Personality Crisis from Winnipeg and all that kind of stuff. Those guys seem to cross paths with that whole scene a lot more. Because when Duff talks about going into Vancouver at 14 years old and playing like the Smiling Buddha and all that kind of stuff, that's the kind of stuff those guys were doing. And there's a whole circuit of punk rock houses across the country that you would crash at. And that's the scene, you know. So the only connection I have is a bizarre, it feels like when you talk about the Loch Ness Monster, you see those, or that Bigfoot photo, you know, this thing, and it's like, is a random photo of Punchy at, I want to say people have been, at the time, the girl I was seeing at the time who has the photo was like, I think it's from the Roxy, or I think it's from the Whiskey, but it might be from Madame Wong's or FX, because there was a whole scene going on down in LA when we talk about Guns N' Roses and the Sunset Strip. There was the Jane's Addiction thing. You know, people forget about that. I really feel like Jane's was the kind of gateway drug into what really led to alternative sort of bashing a door down. And that's where I think Punchy was hanging, if you ask me. And I think that, you know, that scene, like even the Seattle scene, I don't think anybody was really thinking like, we're going to play these dodgy clubs that are basically like Chinese restaurants during the day. And then they have a thing over in the corner where you can play. And then we're going to get signed and we're going to be big rock stars. But guys like Punchy never wanted to be big rock star anyway. He just wanted to play music, which I think is, as you saw, and I think we can talk about this too, and in the 90s, it became like not as cool to be like wearing a Rolex watch or, you know, playing a $5,000 Les Paul. It became like, I might have found this guitar. You know, it's like, it's only got 5 strings because I couldn't afford, you know, it became a lot more like legit, and authentic became the words that are very difficult things to bring up. But it wasn't so much about how fast you could play the guitar, even though Punchy came up like anybody else, probably learning Ted Nugent riffs or something, you know. But that leads into, you know, what's just like loud, heavy rock just turns into, you know, the kind of punk rock that he became known for, or is sort of known for, and which doesn't really, I mean, you can see the translation into creddypool, but like a lot of punk rock musicians who went into alternative music, it carries the punk rock into more of a, you know, structured, you know, it's not like it's just straight up 2-minute pop punk songs. They're actually like became more, you can hear elements of, you know, Sabbath and that kind of stuff. But I feel like a lot of bands like Smashing Pumpkins and that kind of stuff, to me, they feel like what the creddypool sort of like, that's what they must have paid attention to, those guys. You know, female bass player, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that was cool about them is they sort of had their own little sound in that scene, you know, which was kind of cool. And you know, I thought what was kind of cool was, you know, so the bass player Crystal,
mm-hmm.
I mean,
everybody had a crush on Crystal. Let's be honest. I mean,
she was hot, right? I mean, you know, what she reminded me of was the bass player from Smashing Pumpkins.
100%. And she also reminds me of her name escapes me, but the keyboard player for the Dandy Warhols. Everybody in the 90s had a crush on these alternative girls that played on stage. Yeah. You know, and I think it was a ballsy move too, because a lot of, I mean, you know, from that time period, and I mean, it was, you know, it was a boys club for the longest time. I mean, there were definitely certain bands, like suppose a band was recruiting a new band member and somebody would, you know, suggest a chick, and then everybody would, a chick, man. Like, are you insane? Like, yeah, you know, chicks can't play in the band because you know, they need to keep it separated, you know. Like, to be honest, the first time you see a photo of the band, you kind of go like, well, they got one really glammy dude in the band, like you know, was he like, because you'd look at like photos of Poison at first and you'd be like, which of these guys, there's these girls in this band, right? No, those are all dudes, you know. Oh, okay. So it took me a second to go, oh, they've got a female bass player. I think that was one of the first time I had seen anybody who, until like the Pumpkins and a few groups like that, because it had kind of been like a girl band and a guy band, and it became like, then it became sort of like Hole, Veruca Salt, you know, where it was kind of like girls and guys, which seems so stupid now, really. Like, I know some girls that play circles around me, dude. It's like, it's just, there's girls that play in Prince's band, you know. I mean, all those girls that have played with Prince, I should just hang up my stuff, but I already hung them up. I saw the Prince girls playing, I just hung them up.
Looks like you had a lot to hang up.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
Yeah.
you have a lot of hang-ups. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, hey, what's the chance that you could send me that picture of Punchy? Because I'd love to be able to put it on the website.
I randomly spoke to her the other day, and I will chase that down, because she, it's like funny, because people like, they carry those things. Anybody who is into rock music, they carry those kind of things with a great deal of pride. It'd be how it's kind of whispered about at the party. That girl has a picture of Punchy on stage, pre-Creddy pool, and you're like,
it's
really?
like I've got a picture I've got a picture that no one's ever seen of Sid Vicious.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. It's like
you're holding it like I have this special thing. Like
I liken it to that picture, like someone has a picture of JFK with Marilyn Monroe. You're like, what? It's like, that's the kind of stuff. Because for rock and roll guys like me, it's that kind of stuff that's exciting. I'm pretty tight with Duff, and we really haven't talked that much about it. I mean, we talk a lot about the old punk rock days, but it's sort of more in a general term, and like all the Vancouver bands, and a lot of the Canadian bands in general that he is incredibly well versed with. So a lot of the Seattle stuff. I mean, obviously Duff had left. He'd left Seattle, and then a few years later, Seattle exploded. So obviously,
maybe one day I'll chat with Duff, and maybe he can shed some light on it, because as time goes on, like by reaching out to people, and hopefully through the YouTube channel, more people will see this, and I'm hoping that people will come out of the woodwork with photos and tape.
What about
video?
What about current? How have you gotten with current whereabouts, or what happened to, or any of that kind of stuff? This is the kind of stuff that it's not that you don't think about it, because there's so many bands that you go, those guys should have been huge. Whatever happened to those guys? And usually it's a pretty easy Google to chase down that guy's in real estate now, and that guy's in, or whatever, or he's in. But I've never, to be honest, I've never really heard.
It's because here's the reason. It's because they were an unknown band.
Right. Yeah.
The big difference is if you're a band that actually went somewhere, you can dig this information up, because you would have been seen, you would have been photographed.
This is we're talking pre-YouTube, pre-Wikipedia, pre-everything. So that a lot of that stuff just gets lost in the mix. So I think that
there was no cell phones. Like, people weren't
no cell phones
carrying cameras with them to the gig. Like, when you went out, like, I never owned a camera. In fact, I don't think I ever had a camera in my life until it came with the cell phone, right? Like,
yeah, I'm the same way. Yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have had one. So what I've been finding out about this is, because the band, didn't really establish themselves, like they didn't have the record deal. They didn't make the record. They didn't shoot any videos. They were the band that was influential to all the other bands. Like, they had this rehearsal space in Seattle. I can't remember what it was called right now, but all the bands rehearsed there. Every town's got a bunch of little rooms, and all the bands are in there. So apparently, Creddypool was one of those bands that were one of the earlier bands that started the sound. Right. I'm talking like when Malfunction existed, which was Andrew Wood. Yeah. Love Bone. Mm-hmm. So Creddypool was kind of the band that those starting out bands were looking up to, because Creddypool had already started. So they were already a band. They had songs. It's like, and they were gigging. They just had some really crazy shit going on. I mean, the singer was really out there, and then, Punchy was, another, you have two really dominant forces, right?
Yeah.
That are incredibly powerful. And everybody that saw this band just went, oh my God, they are the next big thing. So it kind of got cut off, because whatever happened to them and why they all of a sudden disappeared and fell right off the earth, I think it was a combination of things. I think that things were happening in Seattle so fast, and it was exploding, that it's kind of like, you're getting trampled underfoot.
Yeah.
And you're gone.
Yeah.
You're yesterday's news. Nobody cares about the band that could have, would have.
No.
It's like, okay, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Nirvana. Like, the focus was so intent on those bands that everybody else fell to the wayside. And I think that's what happened to Creddy Pool. I think more so than anything, just their lack of activity. And I've found this with other bands as well. Like, you know, there's bands that you and I know that broke up, and now, like you said, this guy's a real estate guy. This guy's working for the township somewhere. This guy's got a vegan restaurant, but you never hear from them again. And they're living a perfectly happy, normal life. But at one point, they were almost the biggest rock star in the world, right?
But you bring up an interesting point, because I think it's the inactivity that whatever splitting up at that moment, because I remember hearing like Matador or Sub Pop or Sonic Onion, or one of those there was supposed to be a record coming, and you're kind of like, okay. And then in the meantime, as you've got that pinned against the wall, other bands like, say, Mudhoney or Melvins, who'd been around forever, were active enough that when things finally did explode in a town like Seattle, they kind of got caught up in the wave of, like, they didn't go on to be Nirvana or Soundgarden or Alice in Chains, but they were beloved in that scene and kind of got to carry that wave, where if Creddy Pool had been actively working and doing stuff and putting out product, whatever happened at that juncture where they're off to make a record, and whenever a band goes off to make a record, you mentally go, okay, that means like sometime within a few months, 6 months, whatever, there'll be a new record, and then they'll be around. But they just sort of, that I remember that. I don't remember what exactly, but I just remember somebody just saying they're making a record, and that was sort of the last I ever heard of that. And it just, whatever happened during that process, whether somebody decided to go back to school or whatever happened, it just sort of fell apart. And like, you and I both know a million musicians that we used to play with who were all regular people who, you know, why would they be on anybody's radar as far as, you know, they just kind of go away. And what ends up happening with a lot of these Johnny Appleseed bands is these bands that kind of do their thing, and they kind of, you know, someone sees them, Chris Cornell, and decides, I'm going to put a band together. Or Jerry Cantrell sees them and goes, I'm going to put a band together. And it's sort of like, that can happen. And it always seems like whatever's happening right now gets all the attention, while those who had kind of built it from a foundational sense get lost in the mix. And yeah. You know, like I think you nailed it, though. I think as far as the activity goes, if you're out of the public eye for a moment, you will be replaced. Like that, you know, it's just the way it goes in the business. They love you when you're on the cover, and when you're not, they love another. It's the way it goes.
Exactly. No, I mean that's what I heard. Also, I heard that. I mean, I interviewed a guy in Vancouver, record producer guy. And he was telling me that he was actually approached by Creddy Pool. They wanted to get out of Seattle.
Right.
But they didn't have the budget, obviously, because the thing is, like, they didn't even have management. Like, what really killed these guys was the fact that they wanted to do everything themselves. Like, they were their own worst enemy. Yeah. They didn't trust anybody.
No. Yeah.
So we're not going to give our money away. We're not signing anything with anybody. And I think that's what killed them. Their lack of trust and willing to accept the help of others and to see the big picture. It never realized. So they're hoarding it, keeping it to themselves. But in the end, they have nothing. So, you know, they wanted to go and record at this studio, but of course they never showed up. I don't know why. He doesn't know why. He said they sent him a deposit, I think. I know that they were.
Really? Yeah. They actually sent him.
You know. Like,
you've got a deposit, you think you would follow that up.
You know, they sent $25 in an envelope, like of ones, you know, like,
American.
Yeah.
To the Canadian.
But, and I interviewed another person who had them booked to play a showcase at the town pump. I think they were supporting Alice in Chains or somebody like that, or Soundgarden. And they were supposed to come up and play, and they were a no-show. And I know other people in other bands that I've interviewed that went down to Seattle to play shows and had heard of Creddy Pool and knew that there was going to be some tapes released or demo tapes, and they were about to record an album. And, you know, the story was, they're going to be the next big thing. Like,
yeah, of course. Yeah.
You know, and everybody was like, I know those guys, you know? So, you know, they failed to launch. They just never got off the ground. So I'm really happy that, you know, you came on the show, and it's awesome that, you know, you're my first guest on the first episode of the YouTube channel. And, you know, I really appreciate you sharing all this insight, you know, your own career, a snapshot of your life and talking about Creddypool. It's amazing. I'm looking forward to getting the photograph, and I'll I'll put it in the episode, and I'm gonna get these tapes transferred, and hopefully they don't get destroyed in the process. And then I'm gonna start releasing this on my YouTube channel, and so people can hear it for themselves, right? And we have proof now that this mysterious band that could have been looks like it's for real.
It might actually exist. It's an interesting thing because as you were talking, I thought to myself, there was also a certain fear of success, especially during the 90s. There was kind of like I said before, it was almost more respectable to be driving a beat down old Comet than a than a BMW. You know what I mean? And I think that there was, when you talk about bands who were so precious about their thing, they sort of squeezed it to death, like the rabbit in Grapes of Wrath or something. It's kind of like that fear of like selling out. And I think that's probably the kind of thing that leads to not showing up at studios and not. And I don't know what you've heard, but I've heard there was a great deal of tension, especially between the two. And that always is a problem. I don't know what you know about, there was plenty of people who say nightmare to deal with, in that department. I mean, everybody has their own personal reflex. I don't know what the drug situation was. I don't know what the mental health situation is with that kind of stuff, but creative people can come with some baggage, and that's, we see it every day. It's how it goes.
I think they had a lot of baggage. I think that, I mean, this from playing in bands. I've experienced it myself. It's really difficult when you're an artistic, creative person and you have this vision. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing worse than having a similar person in the band with you, because if you have two people who feel that I've got this figured out, I know where the band needs to go, and then they go, well, I'm the band.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I write the songs, or, whatever it is, I have firsthand experience with that it becomes, it's like a tightrope walk, right? It's like, you got to, and it becomes very difficult when you're playing in a band and you're on the tightrope the whole time, because it takes very little, as you hit that tightrope once, and by the time it gets out to where you are, those little tiny vibrations are now this big. And that's why it takes so little to knock you off. And I think that's just basically what happened with these guys. Well, I'm speculating, but
it's the Lennon and McCartney thing, that even they hit the wall, but they made it work for you. You have to kind of take that other guy, and hopefully you can be smart enough to know, this guy's got a great deal of ambition. I have a great deal of ambition. We're kind of heading in other directions. Like sometimes you get this kind of push and pull type thing going on, but hopefully you can keep it together so that the band can grow in either direction with these two like-minded, or sometimes not like-minded people. Unfortunately, those forces often just tear it apart, and it tore the Beatles apart 10 years later or whatever it was. So if those two guys couldn't make it work, then some kids from Seattle, who's to say they couldn't make it work before, entering the studio?
Yeah, no, it's unfortunate for sure, but I think we'll get to the bottom of this. We're starting to get some.
I'm excited.
Get some actual evidence, which is awesome. The photograph that you've got is just one more page out of the book that we can cross an X and go, okay, there's this.
At the time, it was Mother Love Bone, Creddypool. Those were the two names that were being, circulated out of Seattle. I wasn't as aware of Malfunction until after the fact, but those two bands, and we all know what happened with Mother Love Bone. They went on to be one of the biggest bands on the planet. So the fact that the other one, I'm like, well, now I need to know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, Todd, it's been awesome, man. I'm so happy that you came on board.
I'm going to go dig out some old cassette tapes now. Hopefully I've got them uploaded somewhere. Or that stuff doesn't even exist on YouTube, does it?
No.
Everything exists somewhere. I'm surprised. We might have to do some deep digging, but somebody somewhere has this stuff like on CD
you never know.
And uploaded somewhere, but you might have to dig around. Yeah.
That's my quest. That's my mission.
Interesting. Wow.
I'm on a mission to solve the mystery of Creddypool, the greatest Seattle grunge band that you've never heard of. All right, Todd Kerns.
Okay,
Thank you for being in the house. Best of luck. I hope to see you on the road somewhere. And
I hope so. Yeah.
give my love to all those people I love that you know.
And you give my love to the people that I love that you know.
I will. Thanks, Todd. Have a great day, brother. Peace.
Big love. Take care.
All right. Ciao.
Bye-bye.